Welcome to the deep dive. This time we're taking on a text that's, well, it's ancient, but also feels surprisingly relevant today. The Thunder, Perfect Mind.
Okay.
And it's a poem.
Right.
It was discovered in the Nag Hammadi library back in the mid-20th century.
Wow.
Yeah, and we're going to, kind of try to unpack some of its mysteries and see why it still speaks to people, even now.
Yeah, I think what's really remarkable about the Thunder Perfect Mind is how it really does transcend time. It's not just some old document, It has this voice it's so powerful, so direct. It really feels like it's speaking, like, right to you.
Right through across the centuries.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And that voice, the eye of the poem, that's where things get really interesting, right?
Yeah.
It's this voice, but it's full of contradictions.
Okay.
It's saying, I am the first and the last, but also she who is honored and she who is mocked, all at the same time.
Oh, wow.
Like, imagine reading that, right? And then it goes on, I am the whore and the holy woman.
Yeah.
Like, that's going to make you stop and think for a second.
Absolutely. It really grabs you. And I think that's a big part of what makes this poem so fascinating. It's that voice that I and scholars have been trying to figure it out for decades.
Yeah.
Is it like a divine being? Is it like a personification of wisdom? Or is it something else entirely?
Right.
And the thing is, the poem, it gives you these little hints, but it never really gives you a straight answer.
Yeah, it's almost like it's inviting us to kind of confront our own need to categorize everything,
Interesting.
to put things in these neat little boxes. And that idea that we can't always do that things defy expectation. That's all over this text. But it's especially clear in how it uses paradox.
Yeah, the paradox in the Thunder Perfect Mind, that's really at the heart of it. It's not just like a literary device.
Yep.
It's like woven into the very fabric of the whole thing.
It's everywhere.
When that voice is saying, I am the wife and the virgin, or I am he the mother and the daughter, it's like it's making you hold these two completely opposite ideas in your head at the same time.
Yeah, it's jarring.
It is, and I
Exactly.
think that's the point. It's supposed to shake us up, make us question our assumptions about how the world works.
So you're saying it's intentional, this like deliberate use of paradox.
Oh, absolutely. It's doing something really important, I think. It's showing us the limits of language itself, how we try to understand things, you know? We try to put everything into these neat categories, these binaries.
Right. Like it's either this or that.
Exactly. And the poem, it's saying, no, it's way more complicated than that.
So by embracing the contradictions, the Thunder Perfect Mind is sort of pushing us to think outside those boxes, those simple categories.
Exactly.
And speaking of challenging categories, we can't ignore how this poem plays with gender, right? How often do you come across an ancient text that's like blurring the lines between masculine and feminine like this?
Yeah, you're right. That's not something you see every day.
Not at all.
And it's another layer to this poem, to its complexity and why it's still relevant today.
Yeah.
The I often uses feminine pronouns. It identifies with these female figures, but then it'll turn around and embrace like masculine attributes too.
Right. Like when it says, I am he whose image is multiple in Egypt.
Exactly.
It's incredible. To think about when this was written, it feels so modern, almost revolutionary, to be so fluid with gender.
I know, right? It makes you wonder why it took so long for scholars to really pay attention to this aspect of the poem.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? It seems like such a crucial part of the whole thing.
That's a really good question. I think it says a lot about how we see things, how our own time and our own biases can kind of color our interpretations.
For a long time, scholars, they were mainly focused on the feminine aspects of the I.
Like they were just missing this whole other side of it.
It's like they were looking at a puzzle, but only focusing on certain pieces.
Right, exactly. And that's what makes this deep dive so important, right? Because we're trying to look at the whole picture.
Absolutely.
All those different facets, even the ones that might have been overlooked before.
Exactly. And when you start to do that, when you really look at how this poem plays with gender, it opens up a whole new level of meaning. It's like, it's not just about personal identity,
Yeah.
It's making a statement about like the whole system, the way society tries to put people in boxes.
Oh, wow. That's a fascinating connection.
Yeah.
So you're saying like the way the poem uses gender, it's really about power too. Yeah, absolutely. And to really get that, I think we have to remember like the context, This poem, it was probably written what, like first century Roman Egypt.
Right, right.
And back then, honor and shame, those weren't just like ideas, you
Right.
know? They were like this huge part of how people saw the world, how they understood their place in it.
Yeah, I mean, today it's hard to really wrap your head around that sometimes.
Right.
Like your whole social standing, your worth as a person, it was all tied up in those concepts.
Exactly. And within that system, you know, women, they were often kind of like relegated to these positions of shame. They were seen as less powerful, less deserving of honor than men.
Right, yeah.
So when the Eye in Thunder, when it starts claiming these labels, right? Like like slave woman, the one who is despised. It's not just being defiant, you know? It's like this deliberate way of turning those categories upside down.
Wow.
It's exposing the power dynamics behind them.
It's like the poem is saying, yeah, you can try to define me by these terms, but I'm bigger than that. I contain all of it and more.
Exactly. And this idea of challenging these structures, it goes beyond gender, too. Remember, we were talking about patronage.
Right, right. It's that whole system, how people in higher positions, they would provide favors and protection to those below them,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. And it created this whole web of, like, obligations and expectations.
Yeah, a bit like a complicated dance almost.
Right. And the thunder, perfect mind, it disrupts that, too. The I, it refuses to be put in a box within that system. Either sometimes it's the powerful one, the patron, and then, bam, it turns around and it's the client, the one seeking support.
It's incredible how this poem just keeps subverting expectations, like at every turn.
I know, right? It's like it's targeting all these ingrained power structures, right? We talked about gender, patronage, and even remember the distinction between Greek and barbarian.
Or right, because in ancient Egypt, being Greek, that often meant you were civilized, sophisticated.
Exactly.
But barbarian, that was like the outsider.
Right, the uncultured, the not us.
And the thunder perfect mind, it even blurs those lines.
Yeah. It says, I am he whose image is multiple in Egypt. That's totally a reference to Greek identity, right?
Yeah.
But then it also says, I am she who has no image among the barbarians. It's playing with both sides, refusing to be confined.
So again, we see that refusal to be put in a box, to be labeled by these socially constructed categories.
Exactly.
It seems like the thunder perfect mind is really forcing us to confront our assumptions, and not just about, you know, the divine or like the big philosophical questions, but about how we understand the world, the categories we use every day.
And that brings us back to that question of Gnosticism, right? You were right before, it doesn't like fit neatly into that category, but there are these really interesting parallels.
Yeah, especially when it comes to knowledge.
Oh, absolutely.
There's that line, I am the knowledge of my name. It's like it's pointing towards this really deep, personal kind of knowing, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, it's like Gnosticism talked about this secret knowledge, right?
Right.
Something only a select few could access.
Right.
But the thunder, perfect mind, it seems to be saying that true knowledge, it's inside you already.
It's about understanding yourself, your true nature.
Yeah, and embracing all those messy, contradictory parts that make you you.
And maybe that's part of why this poem has resonated for so long.
Yeah.
With so many different people, artists, thinkers, even today, right? It speaks to this very human desire to figure ourselves out, to find our place in a world that can feel really overwhelming sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. But there's this whole other aspect of the thunder perfect mind we haven't even touched on yet.
Oh, right. The idea that it might have been more than just like a written text.
Exactly. This theory that it might have been performed.
Right. I mean, to think about this poem with all its power, its mystery, being brought to life like that.
I know.
What do you think that would have been like? It's like, can you imagine being back in like ancient Egypt? The air is thick with incense, and you've got these flickering oil lamps, you know, casting shadows on the walls.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And then in the middle of all that, someone starts reciting the thunder perfect mind.
Wow, it'd be amazing to kind of travel back in time and see that, wouldn't it?
I know, right? To experience it not just as words on a page, but as this living, breathing performance.
Yeah. And while we can't know for sure, you know, exactly what that would have been like, there are these clues within the text itself, little hints that it could have been a really powerful experience.
Right. Like, just think about the language.
Yeah.
All that repetition, the rhythm of it. It lends itself to being spoken aloud, don't you think?
Oh, absolutely. It's like you can almost hear it.
Right. And then there are those parts where it's directly addressing an audience, like, look at me, all you who contemplate me, or audience, hear me.
Right. It's like it's reaching out from the page.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's trying to connect with something beyond just the words themselves.
And those paradoxes we were talking about, how the poem suddenly shifts perspective. Imagine those being delivered like dramatically.
Oh, wow.
It would have been this really intense experience keeping everyone on the edge of their seat.
I know. It's so tempting to like romanticize it,
I-
to imagine being there in the moment.
Yeah.
But then again, maybe the real power of the thunder perfect mind is that it's not bound to any one time or place.
Right. It speaks to something universal, something that goes beyond any particular context.
Exactly. And speaking of reaching beyond its original context, you mentioned that it's actually had this like surprising impact on contemporary art and culture.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are a bunch of examples, but one that always comes to mind is that Prada film.
Right, the fashion film.
Yeah, back in 2005.
It's not every day you see an ancient Egyptian text pop up in the world of high fashion.
I know, right? It was a pretty bold move, and it definitely got people talking.
So tell me more about it. Like, how do they actually use the thunder perfect mind in this film?
So the film, it was directed by Jordan Scott.
Okay.
And it basically follows this young woman, and she's, dressed in Prada, of course.
Yeah, naturally.
And she's like navigating the city, Berlin, I think, and it's all very modern, taxis, subways, nightclubs, that kind of thing. But then in the background, you hear these lines from The Thunder Perfect Mind.
Wow. That's quite a juxtaposition.
Yeah, I mean, you've got this ancient sacred text, but it's set against this backdrop of like contemporary urban life and high fashion.
Right. So what was the overall effect? What were people saying about it?
Well, it wouldn't be The Thunder Perfect Mind if it didn't spark some debate, right?
Yeah.
Some people, they loved it. They thought it was brilliant, the way it used the poem to comment on like identity, how we, construct ourselves through fashion and how we use clothes to like project different versions of ourselves. Yeah. But then, of course, there were others who like hated it. They thought it was, disrespectful, like it was cheapening the poem, just using it as like a marketing gimmick.
Which, I mean, is a valid concern, right? When you're dealing with something as potentially profound as this text.
Absolutely.
But then again, maybe that's kind of the point, right? Even when you try to put the thunder perfect mind in a box, even when you try to use it for your own purposes, it still has this way of like breaking free.
It resists easy answers, easy interpretations.
Yeah, and that's what makes it so fascinating, so relevant, even after all these centuries, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. This deep dive has been amazing, but it really feels like we've only just scratched the surface.
I know, right? There's so much more to explore.
But if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this, it's that the thunder perfect mind, it's not just some ancient relic, it's a living text. It's still speaking to us today.
And maybe even more importantly, it's asking us to think differently.
To question our assumptions.
About ourselves, about the world, about everything.
And to be okay with the mystery, with the things we can't fully grasp or explain.
Exactly, because maybe, just maybe, that's where the real truth lies.
In the spaces between the lines, in the questions themselves.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the words of the thunder perfect mind and all the questions it raises.
And who knows, maybe those questions will lead you to some unexpected answers, or even better, to some entirely new questions of your own.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.